I live my life a quarter mile at a time.
The 1980s was a very significant period for motorcycling, for many reasons. It was a decade that seen a lot of motorcycling innovations. While there is no doubt that Harley-Davidson and Indian were the very first to create the cruiser class, in 1982, Honda took the cruiser to another level by mounting a powerful and high-revving sports bike engine in the cruiser frame. This bike was their 750 Magna, or V45. This bike was the beginning of a brand new class of motorcycle, the power cruiser, also known as muscle bikes. The V45's liquid-cooled 90-degree V4 double overhead camshaft 16-valve engine produced 80 horsepower, and the bike had a top speed of 201 km per hour. Then, just 1 year later, it was overshadowed by its bigger and more powerful brother, the 1098cc V65 Magna. Its engine produced 116 horsepower. And it would cover the quarter mile in 11.25 seconds, with a top speed of at least 225 km per hour. Then in 1985, Suzuki responded with their 1165cc V4 Medora model. While it produced one more horsepower at the crank than Honda's V65, its best quarter mile time of 11.5 seconds wasn't as quick as the V65 because its horsepower available at the rear wheel was less, 89 horsepower compared to the Honda's 93 horsepower. But the very same year, that being 1985, a very special and very incredible motorcycle also made its debut. This bike was, of course, the Yamaha VMAX. At the time, due to its outrageous styling, it was probably the most un-Japanese looking motorcycle on the road. While its engine was similar to Honda's Magna and Suzuki's Medora, because it too was a V4, the VMAX featured a very special engine innovation that the others didn't have. And this was called V-Boost. In a nutshell, it gradually fed fuel from two carburetors into just one cylinder via a special valve. This valve would open gradually from 6,000 RPM up until it was fully opened, and the result was breathtaking. The VMAX produced an incredible 145 horsepower and 117 newton meters of torque. Remember, this was 1985. 118 of this horsepower was available at the rear wheel, giving the original VMAX absolutely ridiculous acceleration, even by today's standards. The VMAX was just insane. This monster bike had power everywhere and it would cover the quarter mile in under 11 seconds. In fact, on one of his runs, legendary drag bike racer Jay Gleason broke a world record on a stock standard production Yamaha VMAX, covering the quarter mile in 10.33 seconds. It was so good that this first generation remained in production relatively unchanged for more than 2 decades, while production of the Suzuki Medora lasted for only 2 years, because it just wasn't in the same league. While I personally like the looks and admire the engineering that went into the design of the VMAX, there is one thing about the bike that really narks me, that being these things on either side of the bike, air scoops. But the comical thing is, they were purely cosmetic and served no purpose at all. As great as they looked, they just weren't cool.
Kawasaki lets the good times roll. Kawasaki lets the good times roll. Get aboard, get away, and you're gonna say, let the good times roll.
Kawasaki had their Eliminator, as they were called, also known as the ZL1000. It had a liquid-cooled inline 4-cylinder engine which produced 110 horsepower and 91 newton meters of torque. And with a quarter mile time of 11.5 seconds and a top speed of over 220 kilometers an hour, it was pretty much as fast as anything else on the road at that time, except for the VMAX. I was lucky enough to have one of these for a loan bike for a week while my Ducati was in for a major service. Having such a powerful engine on a bike which didn't fold you into a cramped race replica riding position proved, surprisingly, quite refreshing. Twist the throttle and its power would really hit you. It came on fast and hard and continued to do so right up to its red line. But much more impressive was the low end and mid-range power of the bike. It didn't matter what gear you were in, roll-on acceleration was as good as any motorcycle I've ever ridden. It was a brilliant motorcycle, very well balanced and very easy to ride. However, they were only sold for just 3 model years, with a total production number of about 2,500 motorcycles. So they are a pretty rare beast. In the late 1990s, Honda unveiled the first generation of their new Valkyrie. It shared the same liquid-cooled 1520cc horizontally opposed 6-cylinder engine as their legendary Goldwing. However, it was somewhat modified, with hotter cams and 6 carbies instead of the Goldwing's 2. While it looked like more of a traditional cruiser, it was actually a bit of a hot rod, and certainly turned some heads with its performance. It produced 101 horsepower, but what many people don't know is that this figure is quoted at the rear wheel. For some reason, I couldn't actually find out the horsepower that this bike produced at the crank. Anyway, it also produced 138 newton meters of torque, again at the rear wheel. This made the bike much quicker than it looked, and it would cover the quarter mile in just over 12 seconds, with a top speed of 209 kilometers an hour. Even Harley Davidson had a crack at making a muscle bike. When in the early 2000s, they released their all-new design, the V-Rod. It looked like no Harley Davidson before it. The bike was full of aluminium and it was liquid-cooled with a radiator, meaning traditional old-school Harley owners were a bit perplexed. It was also Harley Davidson's first road bike with double overhead camshafts, and its high-revving 1130cc V-twin engine cylinders were at 60 degrees instead of Harley's traditional 45 degrees. But nobody could dispute the fact that this engine was very beautiful. The V-Rod was considered by many, myself included, to be the best looking muscle bike produced up until that time. I was actually seriously considering buying one myself, but after having taken one out for a decent test ride, unfortunately the bike just didn't have enough cornering clearance for my riding style. But the bike still kicked ass. The engine produced 115 horsepower and 114 newton meters of torque. Later models had 123 horsepower. It had a top speed of 220 km per hour and a best quarter mile time of 11.38 seconds. Who says Harleys are slow? Then, similar to what Yamaha did in 1985, Triumph broke the mould again when in 2004 they released their gobsmacking brand new beast, the Rocket 3.
Oh my god!
This bike had a gargantuan 2,294cc inline triple cylinder engine. It was the largest capacity motorcycle that money could buy. Its pistons were 101.6mm in diameter, that's 4 inches, and it produced 140 horsepower, which was slightly less than the VMAX, but the amount of torque it produced was absolutely huge, 200 newton meters at a paltry 2,500 RPM. This massive amount of torque meant the Rocket 3 would accelerate incredibly hard in any gear. In fact, it produced more torque just idling than most bikes produced in total. Its front tyre was as wide as most bikes' rear tyres, and its rear tyre was a whopping 240mm wide. As far as I'm aware, no other production bike at that time had a wider rear tyre than the Rocket 3. And any rider that dared park their bike next to one quickly realised that their bike looked pretty conservative in comparison. It attracted attention which the likes of had never been seen before. A couple of years later, Suzuki had another crack at the power cruiser class when they released their massive M109R Boulevard. For a V-twin in 2006, this bike was ahead of its time in many ways. It had a 1783cc, or 108.8 cubic inches, double overhead camshaft, fuel-injected engine which produced 123 horsepower and 160 Nm of torque. Its streamlined styling is a love it or hate it affair. I think it has a touch of Art Deco styling about it myself. Although nobody would expect a very heavy bike with a long wheelbase to offer crisp handling, and this bike was over 300 kilos, they do in fact handle quite well, although lean angles are still pretty limited. The bike also has excellent brakes and is still sold in North America to this day. For 2009, Yamaha finally released a completely redesigned VMAX. With a 40% increase in capacity, its engine was now 1,679 cc's. It was also fuel injected and now produced almost 200 horsepower, with 167 Nm of torque. Super aggressively styled, with hand-polished aluminium air intakes, which by the way were now functional, an aluminium frame, radial mounted 6-piston front brakes, and massive 52mm front forks, everything about the new VMAX set it apart from any other motorcycle on the road. It was bigger and badder in every single way. Even its handling, while not perfect, was reported as being quite acceptable. With its radical and very sexy styling, a top speed of over 230 km an hour, and a quarter mile time of 10.2 seconds, it is still an intimidating machine for any rider. Sadly, 2020 was the last sales year for this very unique and one of the most iconic motorcycle designs that Yamaha has ever created. Towards the end of the following year, at the Milan Motorcycle Show, Ducati unveiled their new Diavel. It was a mean-looking, lightweight muscle bike that even die-hard sports bike riders couldn't ignore, because unlike most bikes of this type, the Diavel was a proper handling motorcycle that would easily carve up any twisty road. It had Ducati's racing DNA, which meant it was reassuringly stable handling at any speed and any lean angle. And with its trellis frame, there was no mistaking it for any other brand. It looked like a Ducati, and it was absolutely breathtaking, from any angle. Powered by their 1198cc L-twin superbike engine, it pumped out 162 horsepower and 127 Nm of torque. And like all Ducatis, it pretty much had the best of everything, so there's not much point in talking about suspension and brakes, etc. Crack the throttle wide open on this bike, and the long wheelbase, chain final drive and wide 240 rear tyre meant instantaneous rear wheel drive, while the front wheel remained firmly planted. The Diavel would easily rival any bike for off-the-line acceleration. The bike offered 3 riding modes: Sport, which gives full access to its 162 horsepower; Touring mode retains the same amount of available peak power, but with a less aggressive delivery; and Urban, which takes a big bite out of the engine's ferocity, allowing use of only 100 horsepower. Personally, I would rank this bike as one of the best motorcycles that I've ever ridden in my life. And for those of you who constantly bag me up for calling Ducati engines L-twins and not V-twins, if it's good enough for Fabio Taglioni to call them an L-twin, the man who originally designed the Ducati twin cylinder, it's good enough for me. Okay? Honda again turned heads in 2014 when it reintroduced their totally new Valkyrie. It certainly turned the heads of any Judge Dredd fans. Similar to the previous Valkyrie, its engine was taken from the Goldwing, but it was now 1,832 cc's in capacity. However, the Valkyrie was long, low and stripped of any excess. It had no large fairing, no windshield and no panniers, meaning it was substantially lighter than its bigger brother. This put its power to weight ratio in the muscle bike class. It produced 118 horsepower and 167 newton meters of torque, and over 80% of this torque was available as low as 2,200 RPM, which meant this bike really hauled ass and would very easily pull away from idle in top gear. Its styling, however, was pretty futuristic, to say the least. It definitely took some getting used to, and this proved to be its downfall. And this second generation of the Valkyrie was short-lived, and it was discontinued after just 2 years. These days, unless in a very experienced rider's hands, there are not many superbikes that will get near a muscle bike in a sprint race. Superbikes are taller geared, have a higher centre of gravity and a short wheelbase, which all add up to make perfect launches very difficult. Muscle bikes, on the other hand, are long and low, with a very wide rear tyre, and as a result they are much easier to launch off the line. Nowadays, there isn't a huge amount of choices in the muscle bike category, but the ones we do have are pretty fucking impressive. The best news is that they are all different. One is a triple with shaft drive, one is a twin with belt drive, and the other is a 4-cylinder with chain drive. To be straight up, there isn't much difference between all three when it comes to outright performance. So if you're in the market for a muscle bike today, just buy whatever takes your fancy. Because right now, I double dare you to look away. The Triumph Rocket 3 is still the biggest and baddest motorcycle available from any mainstream motorcycle manufacturer. And now, it's substantially lighter than the original Rocket 3, but its engine is larger, with a capacity of 2,458 cc's, and it now produces 165 horsepower and an unbelievable 221 newton meters of torque at just 4,000 RPM. Meaning, this new Rocket 3 does accelerate, pretty much exactly like a rocket. It will go from 0 to 100 km an hour in just 2.73 seconds. With all the electronics these days, many bikes are factory limited in top speeds. The Rocket 3 is limited to 236 km per hour, but I have no doubt an unrestricted bike would easily go much faster. How much faster? I do not know. Ducati also now has two totally different variants of its remarkably agile Diavel, which was first introduced a decade ago. The X Diavel, which is the most classic version, and features Ducati's instantly recognisable steel trellis frame with their famous 90-degree L-twin Desmodronic engine. But it does also feature a first for Ducati, that being it has a belt final drive. It is a 1,262cc 90-degree L-twin. The Euro 5 version produces 160 horsepower and 127 newton meters of torque, while those countries that don't have the Euro 5 version have to settle for 8 horsepower less. 80% of the X Diavel's torque is available at just 2,100 RPM, meaning this bike is exceptionally quick. It will go from 0 to 100 km an hour in 2.6 seconds and cover the quarter mile in 10.4 seconds, and its top speed is at least 260 km an hour. Their other version is their brand spanking new V4 Diavel. It has a monocoque frame, but it is still unmistakably a Ducati. Its 1,158cc V4 engine, which is still at 90 degrees, so I guess you could call it an L4, produces 168 horsepower and 126 newton meters of torque. It's 10 kilos lighter than its brother. However, from 0 to 100, there isn't much between them. But the V4 will amazingly cover the quarter mile in under 10 seconds. And it has a top speed of at least 272 kilometers per hour. However, if not one of these bikes is enough bike for you, there is one other option. The Boss Hoss Super Sport Big Block Motorcycle. Boss Hoss motorcycles are equipped with huge V8 engines and an incredible amount of horsepower. Their big block bike is, wait for it, 8,128 cc's, and it produces, wait for it, 600 horsepower and 770 newton meters of torque. But getting this amount of power onto the tarmac is very difficult indeed. While still very quick, the Boss Hoss bike's acceleration times are not as quick as you think they might be. No doubt, apart from the obvious traction issues, this could also probably have something to do with the fact that these bikes weigh more than half a tonne. So, in summary, and leaving the Boss Hoss motorcycles out of it, the second generation Yamaha VMAX has the most horsepower. The new Rocket 3 has the most torque, but the Ducati V4 Diavel is actually the quickest over the quarter mile.